A 9.9 severity CVE on Linux? Is it the end of the world? No, it isn't. It's a bad vulnerability, but it's definitely not 9.9 level bad. So what actually is the vulnerability? Well, it's an entire exploit chain that can be used to get remote code execution through the CUPS service, which, if you're not familiar, is a service on Linux that allows you to print things, basically. So in summary, this chain involves these 4 specific vulnerabilities that I won't go into the details of. If you want more details, read this blog post. I don't want to steal this person's content. But the summary is that if you're running CUPS with a configuration that listens for certain things over certain ports, then you are vulnerable to a remote code execution. When this issue was originally reported, it had a CVSS, which is the severity rating for CVEs, of 9.9. However, if we actually take a look at the CVEs now, we can see that it has been downgraded to a 9.1, which is still extremely high, but not as high as before. As a reminder, Heartbleed was a 7.5, so a 9.9 for this seems a little bit ridiculous. I guess this is just another piece of evidence that the way that CVE scores are assigned is a little bit arbitrary and doesn't necessarily reflect the real severity of the issue. At least my impression is that a lot of CVE scores are being inflated quite highly. I mean, if we take a look at this feed, which is on Twitter, and this is a notification feed basically of all the latest CVEs that were reported, let's just take a look at the most recent ones. Vulnerability is found in blah blah blah. It has been rated as critical. 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 Problematic. Problematic. Critical. 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 So out of these 10 latest CVEs, 8 of them, 7 of them were labeled critical? I don't know if that's necessarily an indication that the scores are being inflated, but it does seem a little bit suspect when the vast majority of issues that are reported are being treated as critical. Back to this latest issue, what does it do in particular? A remote unauthenticated attacker can silently replace existing printers or install new ones, IPP URLs with a malicious one, resulting in arbitrary command execution on the computer when a print job is started from that computer. Here's the exploit chain explained by Red Hat. Exploitation of these vulnerabilities is possible through the following chain of events. 1. The CUPS browsed service has been manually enabled or started. Note that it has to be manually enabled on Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but on other distros it might be enabled by default. 2. An attacker has access to a vulnerable server which either allows unrestricted access, such as the public internet, or gains access to an internal network where local connections are trusted. 3. The attacker advertises a malicious IPP server, thereby provisioning a malicious printer. 4. A potential victim attempts to print from the malicious device. 5. The attacker executes arbitrary code on the victim's machine. And here's how you can check whether or not your system is vulnerable. You can check the status of the CUPS browsed service. So you can check the status of the service with sudo systemctl status CUPS browsed. And I assume that if you're not using systemd, well, you'd know how to check that. I'm sure you can figure it out. And on my machine, actually, you can see that this is running. And I know for sure that I definitely didn't manually enable this. This distro is KDE Neon, so I guess on Ubuntu-based distros it might be on by default. So that's step 1. If it's inactive, then you know you're definitely not vulnerable. If it's running or enabled, as it is in my case, then you may be vulnerable. You'll need to do more digging to check. In particular, check the CUPS configuration, which is located in this file, /etc/cups/cups-browsed.conf. Okay, let's take a look at this. Cat out this file, and we are looking for the string browse remote protocols. And near the top of this very long file, we can see here that in my configuration, it has browse remote protocols DNSSD. And you're only vulnerable if the value of that is CUPS. So my system is safe, and you should make sure that yours is as well. If it's not, then, well, you should probably just stop the service with sudo systemctl stop cups browse D. And actually, I might as well do that on my machine since I don't really print from it anyway. And I might as well disable it from running on each boot by disabling the service. There we go. I'm posting this video a few days after this exploit has gone live, so at this point it should be fixed in most Linux distros. So make sure your packages are up to date. However, just to be safe, you might also follow the mitigation steps I just mentioned. The author also mentioned that, in case your system can't be updated and for some reason you rely on the service, block all traffic to UDP port 631 and possibly all DNS SD traffic. Good luck if you use zeroconf. And an entirely personal recommendation, take it or leave it, from this author. I've seen and attacked enough of this codebase to remove any cup service, binary, and library from any of my systems and never again use a Unix system to print. I'm also removing every zeroconf avahi/bonjour listener. You might consider doing the same. And so how many systems are vulnerable? Well, it seems to be most Unix-based systems, and this person has actually been, quote, scanning the entire public internet IPv4 ranges several times a day for weeks, sending the UDP packet, and logging whatever connected back. And they got hundreds of thousands of devices that are vulnerable to this, with peaks of up to 2 to 300k concurrent devices. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this blog post. If you want the details, links will be in the description. However, I do want to talk about the process behind how this was actually reported and it was treated. From the personal considerations section of this blog post, the actual work, the heavy boring stuff, started when on September 5th, after confirming my findings, that is, the author's findings, I decided to open a security advisory on the OpenPrinting cups browse D repository and do what to me was the right thing to do, responsible disclosure. Now, I won't go into the details of the initial conversation, or the ones that followed. You are free to read them. I will link them in the description. If they're willing to open any of the threads, and you are willing to read 50+ conversations or not, and make your own opinion. In the author's personal experience, the responsible disclosure process is broken. That a lot is expected and taken for granted from the security researchers by triagers that behave like you have to prove to be worth listening to, while in reality, they barely care to process and understand what you are saying, only to realize you are right all along 3 weeks later, if at all. So it sounds like the person that found this exploit did try to disclose it responsibly, but encountered a lot of friction with the maintainers of this project. 2 days for the research, 249 lines of text for the fully working exploit. 22 days of arguments, condescension, several gaslighting attempts, more or less personal attacks, dozens of emails and messages, more than 100 pages of text in total. Hours and hours and hours and hours and effing hours. Not to mention somehow being judged by a big chunk of the InfoSec community with a tendency of talking and judging situations that they simply don't know. Let that sink in for a moment. WTF. If these claims are true, which, well, I'm just going to take them at face value, it really does say a lot about the community that, unfortunately, it does seem to be very hostile towards outsiders. When somebody points out an exploit that kind of demonstrates code where security wasn't really considered, or if perhaps it was considered, then it wasn't considered sufficiently, or just not implemented correctly, it seems like some people take this as a personal attack, saying that, oh, well, if my code is vulnerable, that means you're saying that I'm a bad programmer. At least that's kind of the impression that I get from reading this, which really is an unfortunate attitude that some people have. The author specifically mentioned that they reached out privately to try to de-escalate and assure whoever was getting offended that their intent was not adversarial. And here is a screenshot of that email. Hi, this is Simone/EvilSocket. That's the person who reported this issue. I wanted to reach out personally to apologize about the chaos my reports might have created, and to make it 100% clear that any criticism I moved is purely technical. As a 40-years-old dude who spent most of his adult life writing code, I know very well that criticizing and attacking something is way easier than writing and creating things, and people that, like you, literally created the very foundations of internet protocols will always have my utmost respect and gratitude. When I noticed something, my laptop, I was like, WTF is this? And then got dragged into the rabbit hole out of concern and a bit of late afternoon boredom. Please feel free to reach out if there's anything I can do to make this easier on you and your team. And later from this blog post, I don't need CVEs to get a job or to prove how good my kung fu is, or any attention other than what my projects and research already provide. I don't play InfoSec influencer like many. To put it like Javier put it, my mission was to interrupt the triager's focus until they're reprioritized. When I saw that what I thought was pretty serious was being dismissed as an annoyance, I used the only platform I had plus a pinch of drama as a tool to have them effing reprioritize. And it worked wonderfully. More fixes happened after 2 tweets than with all the arguing and talking, so shrug. Here's the tweet, by the way. Blue teams always have a never-ending backlog, and they try not to alter the priorities they have set so they can focus. Your mission is to interrupt that focus until they reprioritize. All is well. There is no other way. Thank you. So this just looks like a situation where his concerns were being dismissed, and that these reports were just not being taken seriously and were not given the gravity that they should have been. And so this person used their platform in order to bring more attention to this issue so that these severe issues can be fixed faster. However, that is only one side of the story, and unfortunately the reality is that these projects are run by people, and people aren't perfect. People make mistakes, people can get annoyed, and generally, when you're communicating with people, you have to act like a decent human being. Otherwise, it's easier for emotions to get involved, and you really just don't want that when you're trying to have a purely technical discussion. For example, here is this pull request to review locking/multithreading implementation on the cups browsed repository. This person commented, according to Evil Socket, cups browsed can be held up for an extended period of time. Quote, the lock acquired here doesn't get unlocked until the IPP server has responded. A malicious IPP server can keep the connection going effectively remotely, causing a denial of service. I believe there's also a race condition because internally examine discovered printer record, then tries to unlock and relocks for a while. Evil Socket responds, do you realize that there's tons of people observing these repos and the commits you have been pushing on the public branches for days now, instead of following the suggested procedure for GHSAs? So already, this is kind of a combative attitude, right? It's just not a very pleasant way of interacting. I mean, it is pointing out a real issue, however, it totally could have been done a different way. But that being said, after, 20 days of back and forth, I'd probably get pretty tired of the pleasantries as well, and I'd want to get straight to the point. And the original commenter responds, I have only pushed changes to the private branch of this project, and to the private branches of libcups filters and libppd for the issue reported. The cups repository is a completely separate project, which is why macOS isn't affected and not subject to the GHSAs you filed. And, wow, this comment was actually marked as a violation of GitHub acceptable use policies, so I guess a GitHub admin must have stepped in and, deleted it. I had this page open yesterday, and this comment was definitely still up, so it looks like it was deleted in the past 24 hours by a GitHub admin. Fortunately, we have the Wayback Machine for this, so here's the original comment. Are you for effing real, man? Do you think people are stupid? With a link to this public commit that fixes some of the bugs that led to this security vulnerability. And someone commented, uh-oh. So while Evil Socket might be correct in this case, that these commits were posted publicly, and they probably shouldn't have been, they were being a real asshole about it. And again, the reality is that when you're working with people, acting like a total asshole doesn't exactly make volunteers want to work with you anymore. And the discussion was locked as too heated, and further comments are not allowed. Now, some people might say, oh, well, that kind of technical-only attitude where the only thing that matters is the quality of your code is the correct way to do things. I mean, look at what Linus Torvalds has been doing in the Linux kernel. He's been fairly abrasive in the past. And, well, yeah, he was in the past, and that was effective for a time. Even Linus Torvalds has changed, right? I mean, he kind of went away for a while. He went to get anger management therapy. Since then, he's been a lot more reasonable when communicating with people. And I don't think that has led to worse code being committed to the Linux kernel. And in fact, I think quite the opposite, actually. I think that has made the community a bit more open and a bit more inclusive. That has led to more people contributing quality code into the project. And so really what I'm trying to say is that if you act like an asshole, people aren't going to want to work with you. So I do think this is kind of an everyone sucks here sort of situation. These real security issues shouldn't have been ignored, and they should have been treated with the gravity that they deserve. I mean, this is a pretty significant security vulnerability. But at the same time, I believe this would have gone a lot smoother if the person reporting it wasn't acting like an asshole. I'm curious what your point of view is on this. Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.